He had cleaned his machine gun the night before the world ended. Not the world as we know it. His world. The world of absolute certainty, of concrete walls and overlapping fields of fire, of a war that Germany had already decided it would win. By midnight on June 5, 1944, Gefreiter Hinrich Seau sat in his reinforced bunker at strong point WN62, overlooking a dark and restless English channel, completely convinced that whatever was coming, he was ready for it. He was not ready. Nobody was. What happened in the next 24 hours would not just break an army, it would break a belief system. It would shatter the psychological foundations of men who had been told, repeatedly, confidently, and with absolute authority, that they could not be defeated here, that this beach, this wall, this position was impregnable, that if the Allies ever dared to come, they would be slaughtered before they even touched the sand. They were wrong. And the way they discovered how wrong they were is one of the most psychologically devastating stories of the entire Second World War. This is not the story of D-Day as victory. This is the story of D-Day as it felt from the other side of the gun sight, from inside the bunkers, from the perspective of men who watched the horizon fill with ships and felt something break inside them that no training had ever prepared them for. To understand the German collapse on June 6, 1944, you have to understand what they believed in the months and years before it. Because the defeat at Normandy was not simply a military failure, it was a catastrophic collision between an ideology and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what German soldiers had been told about their enemies and what those enemies actually turned out to be. Germany had spent years constructing not just a wall along the Atlantic coast, but a wall inside the minds of its soldiers, a psychological fortress built from selective information, manufactured victories, and racial ideology that insisted the Western democracies were weak, disorganized, and incapable of mounting the kind of sustained, coordinated military effort that real warfare demanded. German soldiers genuinely believed this, not because they were foolish, but because everything they had been shown supported it. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British had fled at Dunkirk. America, for all its industrial noise, had never faced the Wehrmacht in a serious engagement. So when the High Command told them that any Allied invasion would be crushed within hours, they believed it. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel personally inspected their positions along the Normandy coast in the spring of 1944, studied their fields of fire, examined their concrete fortifications, and declared that the first 24 hours would be decisive, they took comfort in his words. This was the Desert Fox, the most respected military commander in Germany. If Rommel said they were ready, they were ready. Rommel had thrown himself into the Atlantic Wall preparations with characteristic intensity. He had walked beaches, crawled into bunkers, argued with generals, and driven his subordinates relentlessly to strengthen positions he considered dangerously weak. He had ordered millions of wooden stakes planted in coastal waters to impale landing craft. He had demanded more mines, more obstacles, more concrete. He had told his staff, bluntly and repeatedly, that if the Allies established a beachhead, Germany would lose the war. Therefore, the Allies must not establish a beachhead. They must be destroyed on the beaches themselves before they could bring their industrial weight to bear. At Omaha Beach alone, the defensive preparations were staggering on paper. 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 4 artillery positions, 18 anti-tank gun emplacements, 45 rocket launcher sites, 85 machine gun nests, 6 mortar pits. The beach itself had been transformed into an engineered killing ground, with 3,700 obstacles planted in the tidal zone, Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with teller mines, all designed to tear apart landing craft and funnel survivors into pre-registered kill zones where machine guns could reach them from multiple angles simultaneously. 6.5 million mines had been laid along the Normandy coast, though Rommel had wanted 60 million and never stopped demanding more. The man understood instinctively what his superiors seemed unable to grasp, that what looked formidable from a distance might be catastrophically insufficient when measured against what the Allies were actually capable of bringing to bear. He had seen British and American industrial capacity in the desert campaigns of North Africa. He had watched supply ships arrive for the enemy in quantities that simply did not make sense by German logistics standards. He knew something his soldiers did not yet know, that the enemy they were preparing to face was not the weak, divided collection of democracies described in German propaganda. It was something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name, but would, by the end of June 6, 1944, be understood by every surviving German soldier on the Normandy coast. But in the days before the invasion, these fears were not spoken aloud. German military culture did not encourage that kind of honesty, and so the soldiers of the Atlantic Wall went about their preparations with a confidence that was partly genuine and partly performed, each man telling himself and his comrades that the defenses were solid, that the plan was sound, that they would hold. Heinrich Seau wrote to his girlfriend in Metzingen 3 days before D-Day. "The invasion will be their grave," he told her. "We will throw them back into the sea within hours." He carried her reply in his pocket when he cleaned his MG-42 on the night of June 5th. She had promised to wait for him until the war's victorious end. He had no reason to doubt he would return. The meteorological situation in the first week of June 1944 had given the German High Command exactly the kind of false comfort that was most dangerous, the comfort of confirmation. Luftwaffe meteorologist Walter Stube had studied the weather data from U-boat reports and weather stations and delivered his assessment with professional certainty. The conditions over the English Channel were prohibitive for any large-scale amphibious operation. Winds at 20 to 25 knots, waves reaching 6 feet, ceiling at 500 feet and dropping. Stube concluded that conditions would remain unfavorable for invasion for at least 2 weeks. This assessment had consequences that were almost incomprehensible in their strategic magnitude. Based on Stube's forecast, senior German commanders began treating the first week of June as an operational vacation. Rommel himself left for Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying with him a pair of gray suede shoes he had purchased in Paris as a gift. He genuinely believed he had time. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, ordered his division commanders to attend war games at Rennes, pulling some of the most critical decision-makers in the Normandy defense away from their posts at the precise moment they would be needed most. Naval patrols that normally swept the Channel were canceled due to rough seas. The routine alertness that should have characterized a defensive force expecting invasion was replaced by something closer to routine peacetime administration. What Stube and German intelligence did not know and could not know was that the Allies possessed weather stations the Germans had never mapped, stations in Greenland, high-altitude weather reconnaissance flights over the mid-Atlantic, sources of meteorological data that painted a fundamentally different picture of what was happening in the skies over the English Channel. Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, had spotted something in the data that Stube had missed entirely. A narrow window. 36 hours, perhaps 48, when the storm would partially relent. Not ideal conditions, not comfortable conditions, but conditions that, for a commander of sufficient nerve and vision, were usable. Eisenhower had that nerve. On the evening of June 5th, sitting in his command caravan at Southwick House, listening to rain hammer the windows and wind shake the structure, he made the decision. They would go. June 6th was the day. Across the Channel, the German High Command slept.
The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came just before midnight on June 5th, when radar operators along the Norman coast began picking up formations on their screens unlike anything they had tracked before. The Freya and Wurzburg radar sets, Germany's primary coastal detection systems, showed massive aerial formations approaching from the north. But the operators had seen similar blips before. Allied deception missions were a regular feature of the electronic landscape over the Channel. Missions designed to keep German radar operators tense and overextended, seeing threats everywhere, able to confirm nothing. So the officers reported what they saw, filed their reports, and waited for clarification from higher command. By midnight on June 6th, the reports coming in from across Normandy had stopped making the kind of sense that headquarters was prepared to process. Paratroopers were landing, but where? Units to the east reported them falling from the sky en masse. Units to the west reported the same. Some said they were British, others said American. The locations made no coherent pattern that the German operations staff could fit into any invasion template they had prepared for. What they did not know was that alongside the real paratroopers of the British 6th Airborne and the American 72nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the Allies had dropped thousands of dummy paratroopers as part of Operations Titanic and Rupert. These dummies, equipped with firecrackers that simulated small arms fire when they hit the ground, were spreading through Normandy like seeds of confusion. Every German unit that chased a phantom paratrooper landing was a unit not responding to real threats. Every report of paratroopers in a new location added another layer of paralysis to a command structure that was already functioning without its senior leadership. Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, understood what was happening faster than almost anyone else in the German chain of command. Woken by reports of paratroopers landing near his positions, his professional instincts immediately assembled the tactical picture. This was not a raid. This was not a deception. The paratroopers were marking the flanks of something much larger. He needed to attack immediately, before the enemy could consolidate. He reached for the telephone and requested permission from division headquarters. The response came back clear and unmistakable in its strategic catastrophe. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Von Luck would spend years trying to explain in interviews and in his memoir what that moment felt like. He had known, with the certainty of a professional soldier who has studied warfare his entire adult life, that every minute of inaction was a minute gifted to the enemy. The Allies were not going to stop and wait for the German command structure to reach a consensus. They were moving, organizing, strengthening, digging in, doing everything that soldiers do in the minutes and hours after a dangerous landing to make themselves impossible to remove. And the Germans were sitting by their telephones waiting for the situation to clarify. The situation did not clarify. It exploded. At 5:30 hours on June 6, 1944, as the first gray light began to separate the sky from the sea along the Normandy coast, German observers in forward positions reported something that their training had not prepared them for. From the observation posts and bunkers overlooking the English Channel, men squinted through binoculars, through rangefinders, through the optical sights of artillery pieces and machine guns, and saw something that the human mind struggles to process when it encounters it for the first time. Ships, more ships than most of them believed existed in the world. Not a fleet, not an armada in the historical sense of that word, something beyond those categories. From horizon to horizon, as far as the eye could reach in either direction, the English Channel was covered with vessels, battleships and destroyers and cruisers and minesweepers and landing craft and merchant ships and specialized vessels that no one on the German side had ever seen before. They stretched across the water like a gray moving city, and they kept coming, more emerging from the distant haze, as if the sea itself was generating them from somewhere beyond the visible world. The Allied invasion fleet consisted of 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, 864 merchant ships. It was the largest naval armada ever assembled in the history of human warfare, and the German defenders were seeing it for the first time on their gun sights on the morning it arrived. Bernard Firking, an artillery officer at WN-62, who would be killed before the day ended, reportedly turned to his men and told them they were watching the whole world arriving on their doorstep. It was not hyperbole. It was the most accurate description possible of what they were seeing. These were not soldiers from one nation. They were not soldiers from two nations. They were the assembled military power of Western civilization, coordinated across an ocean, launched from the island fortress of Britain, representing the productive capacity of American factories, the courage of British and Canadian soldiers, the resources of an entire alliance that had decided this beach, this morning, this moment was where the war would turn. And then the guns opened up.
At 05:35 hours, the naval bombardment commenced. What followed was something that even veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Soviet artillery barrages of terrifying intensity, described afterward in terms that reached for religious and geological language because military language was insufficient. The battleship USS Texas alone fired 255 14-inch shells at Point du Hoc in 34 minutes. HMS Warspite, which had opened fire on the German positions at approximately 0500 hours, would deliver over 315 15-inch shells in the first 2 days of the campaign. The cumulative weight of metal and explosive dropped on the German defensive positions along the Normandy coast in those opening hours exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in any previous campaign. Inside the concrete bunkers that German propaganda had described as impregnable, men were discovering that no engineering is truly impregnable when sufficient force is applied to it. Bunkers designed to specifications that should have made them proof against any conventional bombardment began to crack. Men who had placed absolute confidence in the concrete around them found that confidence disintegrating shell by shell. Some were buried when roofs collapsed. They were dug out by their comrades, gasping and shaking, covered in dust and blood, only to be buried again minutes later as the bombardment continued. The physical destruction was matched by psychological destruction that may have been even more complete. These men had been told the wall was impregnable. They were now inside a wall that was crumbling around them, and the bombardment was not stopping. It would not stop. It came from the sea, and the sea was full of ships, and the ships carried ammunition in quantities that made German supply calculations look like arithmetic performed in a different universe. And then came the moment that many German veterans would later identify as the precise instant when they understood, truly understood, that everything they had been told was wrong. The Luftwaffe was supposed to respond. Since the earliest planning for the defense of occupied France, German soldiers had been assured that any Allied invasion fleet would be met by the full strength of German air power. The Luftwaffe had defeated the RAF over France in 1940, had bombed London into rubble, had provided the close air support that made blitzkrieg possible. When the Allies came, the German Air Force would be there. Everyone knew it. It was not a hope, it was a certainty. Oberst Lieutenant Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, received the orders that morning. He was to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His response, recorded in his wing's war diary, was 4 words. What entire force? I have 2 planes. The Luftwaffe, which had promised air superiority over any invasion beach, which had been the instrument of German military dominance from Poland to the gates of Moscow, could muster 319 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,674. Priller and his wingman Heinz Wodacek made what became one of the most absurd and somehow also most heroic gestures of the entire war.
They climbed into their FW-190s, flew south at high speed beneath the overcast, ripped across Sword Beach at low altitude in a single strafing run, and fled north again through a sky filled with Allied fighters before anyone could properly respond to them. 2 planes, against thousands of ships, against 156,000 men landing on the beaches, against an operation that had been planned for 2 years and consumed the industrial capacity of an entire continent. 2 planes, making a single pass and then disappearing. It was not heroism that made this moment significant, though there was a kind of terrible heroism in it. It was what it revealed. The German soldiers watching from their bunkers, the men who had been promised that the Knights of the Air would darken the skies against any invasion, understood what they were seeing. The Luftwaffe was not coming. There was no Luftwaffe. What had been one of the most feared air forces in the world had been ground down through years of attrition, of failed production, of strategic decisions that stripped fighters from where they were needed to serve ideological projects, until on the most important morning of the war, it could send 2 planes. 2 planes, and then nothing. At 0630 hours, the first assault waves hit the beaches. Heinrich Seau manned his MG-42 at WN-62 and began firing at 0635 hours. His position had survived the bombardment largely intact, which placed it in a minority among German defensive positions along Omaha Beach. His gun commanded a perfect field of fire across the beach and into the water beyond it. The MG-42 was the finest machine gun in the world at that moment in military history, capable of firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, producing a sound so distinctive that Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. In 9 hours at his position, Seau would fire 13,500 rounds. What was happening on the beach in front of him was carnage of a kind that would become legendary in the history of D-Day. The landing craft were hitting obstacles. They were being hit by artillery before they reached the shore. They were ramps dropping into water too deep for men burdened with 60 pounds of equipment to survive in. Men were drowning before they could be shot. Men were being shot before they could find cover. The first waves at Omaha Beach suffered casualties that, if sustained, would have ended the operation entirely. But they were not sustained, because the thing that no German defensive calculation had adequately prepared for was not the courage of individual Allied soldiers, as extraordinary as that was. It was the arithmetic behind them. For every man who fell, there were more men behind him. For every landing craft destroyed by the obstacles or the artillery, there were more landing craft coming. The supply of human beings willing to cross that beach and accept whatever the German defenders could do to them was not a finite quantity that the defenders could exhaust. It was connected to something that could not be reduced to 0. By midday, the German positions began reporting something that sent a particular kind of chill through the command structure. They were running out of ammunition. This was not supposed to happen. The defensive plans had calculated ammunition expenditure based on holding off a limited assault force for a limited period before relief and resupply arrived. Nobody in the German planning process had seriously modeled what would happen if the assault was not limited. If instead of repelling one wave, and then another, and then a third, the defenders simply kept firing and the waves kept coming, relentlessly, mechanically, like a production line rather than an army.
Positions that had been calculated to have 3 days of ammunition exhausted their supplies in hours. Artillery batteries, the backbone of any defensive position, faced identical crises. The carefully stockpiled shells that represented weeks of logistics effort vanished into the bombardment and were gone. And when the German commanders attempted to bring forward reserve stocks from positions further inland, they discovered the second dimension of Allied superiority that made the supply crisis unsurvivable. Every road was under constant attack from the air. Allied fighter bombers, operating in conditions of complete air superiority, had turned movement in daylight across the Normandy road network into a death sentence.
trucks carrying ammunition exploded on the highway. Horses pulling supply wagons were killed by strafing runs. Supply columns that should have taken hours to reach their destinations were destroyed before they cleared their starting points. The contrast with Allied supply operations was grotesque. Allied ammunition expenditure in a single day exceeded German monthly production capacity. American destroyers fired hundreds of shells at single targets, while German artillery pieces were rationed to 4 rounds per gun per day by the afternoon of D-Day. 4 shells per day per gun to stop an invasion force landing in their thousands and tens of thousands. The Armored Reserve, the force that Rommel had specifically demanded must be positioned close enough to the beaches to counterattack before the Allies could consolidate, remained paralyzed through the entire critical morning. The 21st Panzer Division, the only substantial armored unit positioned anywhere near the Normandy beaches, did not receive orders to attack until 10 o'clock hours, 4 full hours after the landings had begun. 4 hours in which the Allies were landing men, pushing inland, destroying German strongpoints, and making the beachhead wider and deeper with every passing minute. When the 21st Panzer finally attacked at 16:20 hours, advancing between British airborne landing zones toward the coast, they found something they had not expected to find. They found gaps. Actual gaps in the Allied line, places where the advance had outrun its flanks, places where a determined armored thrust might genuinely reach the beach, cut the beachhead in two, create the kind of tactical crisis that might slow the invasion enough to matter. By approximately 1900 hours, elements of the 21st Panzer had reached the coast between Lyons-sur-Mer and Leux-sur-Mer. They were the only German armored unit to touch the coast on D-Day. And then, at 2100 hours, they looked up. Operation Mallard, 250 gliders bringing reinforcements to the British 6th Airborne Division, arriving in a stream from the north, descending toward the fields inland from the beaches in a display that, to German eyes, already psychologically shaken by everything the day had brought, looked nothing so much as the sky itself delivering an army behind them. The panzer commanders, fearing encirclement, ordered withdrawal. The one German armored unit that had actually reached the coast on D-Day pulled back. They had lost 54 tanks and armored vehicles, roughly 25% of their total strength, in a single day of operations, and they had not, in the end, changed anything at all. The confusion created by Allied airborne forces throughout D-Day had multiplied German problems in ways that are difficult to fully quantify. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne had not, in most cases, landed precisely where they were intended to land. The drops were scattered, the units fragmented, the planned objectives often impossible to execute with available strength. But this very chaos created a different kind of problem for German defenders than the one it created for Allied commanders. For the Allies, scattered drops meant reduced operational effectiveness in specific locations. For the Germans, scattered drops meant paratroopers appearing everywhere, in every field, on every road, behind every hedgerow, so that no German movement anywhere in Normandy could proceed without the fear of running into an enemy that might be in front, behind, or to either side. General Erich Marx, commanding the LXXVIII Corps, was traveling by car to his headquarters in the early morning hours when his vehicle was shot at from a roadside ditch. He spent the rest of D-Day unable to visit his forward units personally. German battalion commanders made decisions without knowing where their flanks were, because their flanks might be standing next to a paratrooper who had landed there 3 hours earlier and made himself at home. The psychological weight of this uncertainty is almost impossible to overstate. In warfare, uncertainty is itself a weapon, and the Allied airborne operation had weaponized uncertainty on a massive scale. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydt, Germany's most experienced paratrooper commander, serving with the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment in Normandy, watched the Allied airborne operation with professional recognition that he found devastating to process. He had fought in German parachute operations that were considered daring and successful, What he was watching now was on a different plane of existence. We dropped battalions, they dropped divisions. We were supplied by single aircraft making dangerous individual sorties. They had endless streams of gliders and transport planes, a continuous river of men and equipment flowing from the sky. The scope of it made every German airborne operation he had participated in look like a theoretical exercise rather than actual warfare. As the day progressed, Allied aircraft and French resistance fighters systematically destroyed German communications across Normandy. Telephone cables that had taken months to lay were cut. Radio relay stations were destroyed. Allied electronic warfare units jammed frequencies that German units depended on for coordination. Generalleutnant Max Penzel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, sat at his headquarters in Le Mans, watching the communication network dissolve around him. His war diary records a kind of operational blindness descending through the afternoon, as contact with forward units disappeared one by one, and entire divisions ceased to exist as entities he could communicate, coordinate, or direct. Individual unit commanders made decisions in isolation. Platoon leaders chose whether to hold their positions or attempt withdrawal without any information about what was happening to their left or to their right. Company commanders ordered counterattacks against objectives they could not locate on maps that no longer reflected the reality on the ground. And through all of this, the Allied forces kept coming, landing, advancing, consolidating, with a supply chain that functioned with stunning mechanical efficiency because the Allies had spent 2 years planning this operation, which meant they had spent 2 years planning every contingency and building the logistical infrastructure to address them. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the men who had spent months building their confidence in the Atlantic Wall sat in what remained of their positions and tried to understand what had happened to them. Generalleutnant Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, which had absorbed the heaviest of the British assault, reported to 7th Army headquarters with words that captured the day's catastrophe in their bureaucratic terseness. Division combat strength 35%, all coastal strongpoints lost, artillery 90% destroyed, enemy advancing inland. This was the language of a formation that had ceased to function as a military unit. In the careful, unemotional vocabulary of military reporting, Richter was saying something very simple: we are finished.
The nights that followed brought no relief. German units attempting to regroup and counterattack discovered that Allied superiority did not stop when darkness fell. Radar tracked German movements. Flares lit the countryside as bright as midday whenever German vehicles tried to use the roads. Naval gunfire reached inland with an accuracy that seemed impossible, shells arriving from the sea to detonate on targets that no gun crew should have been able to locate in darkness at that range. Hans von Luck, who finally received permission to commit his Panzer Grenadiers after the sun had gone down, led his forces toward Sword Beach in the dark and was immediately caught in what he described as an illuminated nightmare, parachute flares turning night to day, while destroyer shells fell with horrifying precision. He lost half his strength without seeing a single enemy soldier. The German supply situation, already critical on D-Day itself, became existential in the days that followed. Allied air forces had executed what military historians would later call the Transportation Plan, a systematic effort to destroy every road, railway, and bridge that could carry German reinforcements or supplies toward Normandy. The results were catastrophic beyond German expectations, which had not expected the enemy to have either the intelligence to identify every critical node in the French transportation network or the air assets to destroy them all simultaneously. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, one of the most formidable armored formations in the German order of battle, was stationed near Toulouse when the invasion came. The distance to Normandy, under normal military conditions, should have been a journey of 3 days. Instead, Das Reich took 17 days to reach the front.
17 days of movement under constant air attack, of bridges discovered destroyed and alternative routes found and then attacked in turn, of fuel running low because fuel convoys were themselves under attack, of vehicles breaking down because replacement parts had to travel the same impossible roads. By the time the division arrived in Normandy, it had lost 30% of its vehicles without engaging a single Allied ground unit. It had been weakened by the journey itself, by the simple act of moving across France in a way that made a mockery of German tactical doctrine, which depended on rapid movement, on speed as both a military and psychological weapon. And all the while, Allied logistics continued to function with an efficiency that German observers found almost supernatural. LST landing ships discharged entire armored regiments in hours. Within days of D-Day, Allied forces were landing 15,000 tons of supplies daily on the Normandy beaches. 15,000 tons every day. This figure, when German supply officers calculated it against their own logistics capacity, produced numbers that simply stopped making sense. A single American infantry division consumed more supplies in 24 hours than an entire German corps. And those supplies kept arriving, perfectly organized, efficiently distributed, backed by an industrial system operating at a scale that German planning had never genuinely modeled, because doing so would have required German planners to confront a conclusion their ideology would not permit them to reach, the conclusion that they were going to lose. By June 12th, German forces in Normandy were experiencing the early stages of organizational collapse. The losses of the first week, approximately 26,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, equivalent to 2 full divisions, were being replaced not at all or at a trickle that bore no relation to the rate at which men were being consumed. Allied strength, by contrast, grew with every hour. Cherbourg fell on June 26th, a port city that had been fortified over 4 years, garrisoned by 21,000 men, and declared by its commander to be a fortress that would hold for months. It fell in 5 days of serious fighting. Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, who had proclaimed he would defend Cherbourg to the last bullet, surrendered with his garrison intact. In his post-war interrogation, he explained his reasoning with a phrase that had become almost universal among German commanders in Normandy. Resistance had become meaningless against unlimited enemy resources. Operation Cabra, beginning on July 25th, delivered what the Normandy campaign's opening had promised. The preparatory bombardment involved 1,507 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers, dropping over 4,100 tons of bombs into an area 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, which had been one of Germany's finest armored formations, reported to Army Group B in language that had abandoned all military formality. "My division is annihilated. The psychological effect on the survivors is indescribable. They are no longer soldiers, but broken men." The bombing had been so intense that it had killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, who had been observing from a position thought to be well beyond any danger zone. If American generals were not safe from their own firepower at what was considered a safe distance, the question of what German soldiers at the point of impact had experienced was not one that language could adequately answer. The Falaise Pocket, August 12th through 21st, was the final act of the Normandy catastrophe. Allied forces closed around the remnants of the German force in France, tightening a noose that offered the choice of death or surrender. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. 50,000 were captured. Over 300 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, along with 2,500 other vehicles. German soldiers attempting to escape through the narrowing gap described an environment of total destruction that had moved beyond anything military experience had prepared them for. Roads carpeted with dead horses and burning vehicles, fighter bombers arriving in waves every 20 minutes with clockwork regularity, as if the attacks were scheduled on a production timetable, artillery falling without pause. The destruction was so complete, so systematic, and so inescapable that many soldiers simply stopped. They sat down in the chaos and waited to be taken prisoner because the alternative was certain death, and the mathematics of the situation had become clear even to the most committed. The final accounting of the Normandy campaign tells a story that numbers alone struggle to contain. German losses from June 6th to August 31st, approximately 320,000 casualties, including 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and 210,000 missing or captured. 2,300 tanks destroyed, representing virtually all armored strength in France. 2,127 aircraft lost. Allied losses, 209,672 casualties, with replacements exceeding losses daily. Approximately 4,000 tanks lost, replaced within weeks. 4,101 aircraft lost from a force exceeding 13,000, the losses absorbed without any significant impact on operational capability. The German officers who survived Normandy provided the most honest assessments of what had happened to them. Generaloberstleutnant Hans Eberbach, who assumed command in Normandy after Rommel was wounded by Allied aircraft in July, reported to OKW in early August with a coldness that represented either extraordinary professional discipline or simple exhaustion with the performance of optimism. The enemy's material superiority is at least 20-1 in artillery, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute in aircraft. He can replace all losses within days. We cannot replace anything. This was not a defeated commander making excuses. This was a professional soldier providing an accurate assessment of a military situation that had become mathematically impossible.
Rommel's own final report to Hitler, delivered on July 15th, 2 days before Allied aircraft attacked his staff car and left him with severe head injuries from which he would never fully recover, was written in the carefully euphemistic language that German officers used when delivering truths that Hitler was known not to want to hear. "The troops are fighting heroically everywhere," Rommel wrote, "but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material is beginning to tell. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay." Every professional soldier who read that report understood what it meant. Germany's most celebrated commander, the man who had defined German military brilliance for a generation, was telling Hitler that the war was lost. He was using the language available to him, the language of military courtesy and bureaucratic formality, but the meaning was as clear as any battlefield casualty report. We cannot win this. What made Normandy unique as a military defeat was not its scale, though the scale was enormous. It was what it revealed to the men who experienced it about the nature of the war they were actually fighting, as opposed to the war they had believed they were fighting. German soldiers had been raised in a military culture that emphasized the decisive importance of the individual warrior, of tactical brilliance, of moral and racial superiority over an enemy whose industrial wealth could never compensate for the fundamental weakness of democratic societies. They had been told and had believed that one German soldier was worth 10 Russians, 5 Americans, 3 British. They had been taught that courage and superior tactics would always ultimately prevail over material superiority. Normandy proved in the most absolute terms imaginable that this was not true. Ford's Willow Run plant produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. American factories built 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Allied ammunition expenditure on a single day of the Normandy campaign exceeded German monthly production. A single American division consumed more supplies daily than an entire German corps. These were not just statistics, they were the architecture of an entirely different kind of warfare,
one in which the outcome was determined not on the battlefield at all, but in factories, in shipyards, in the supply chains that connected industrial production to military consumption, in the organizational capacity of societies that had mobilized their entire economic potential for the purpose of winning a war. The German soldiers who faced D-Day had brought to that beach everything that German military culture prized most: courage, training, tactical sophistication, the specific, honed skills of soldiers who had been fighting and winning since 1939. They had brought all of this, and they had been overwhelmed not by greater courage or superior tactics or better soldiers, but by arithmetic, by the simple, brutal mathematics of industrial production and logistical efficiency that made every German advantage in individual combat irrelevant when measured against the scale of what the Allies could bring to bear. Hans von Luck, who had spent D-Day watching the paralysis of his own command structure with a professional's anguish, wrote about Normandy in his memoir with a clarity that years of reflection had given him. We learned that modern war was not about tactics or courage, but about production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial process. They manufactured victory on assembly lines. This was not the observation of a defeated man seeking excuses for his failure. It was the observation of an intelligent professional who had watched the future of warfare arrive on the beaches of Normandy and recognized it for what it was. Friedrich von der Heydt, the paratrooper commander who became a professor of international law after the war, returned to Normandy in later years for commemorations and reunions with Allied veterans he had fought against. His written reflections on the campaign contain a passage that may be the most honest German accounting of what happened there. "Normandy taught us that the era of warrior heroes was over," he wrote. "War had become a matter of industrial capacity, and we had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with horses and outdated dreams." Hinrich Seeau, the machine gunner of WN-62, spent the rest of his long life haunted by June 6, 1944. He met American veterans of D-Day in the decades after the war, men who had crossed the beach in front of his gun, men who had seen their friends killed by the rounds he fired in those 9 hours. He wrote about these meetings in his 2005 memoir with a simplicity that is more powerful than any rhetorical complexity could have achieved. "We all realized we had been young men thrown into an industrial slaughterhouse. My 13,500 round meant nothing against their unlimited replacements." He had fired until the barrel of his gun warped from heat. He had fired until the ammunition ran out. He had watched through his gun sight as the tide of men and machines on the beach below him did not diminish, but grew, as the army he had been helping to hold back simply brought more of everything and kept coming. He began June 6th believing the invasion would be thrown back within hours. He ended it surrounded by thousands of empty shell casings, his hands shaking, his gun destroyed by its own use, watching an invasion force that had not been thrown back, but had instead taken root, established itself, and begun the process of becoming permanent. Everything he had been promised about that day had been wrong. The wall had not held. The Luftwaffe had not come. The armor had not counterattacked in time. The ammunition had run out. And the enemy had simply kept landing, as if the entire English Channel behind them was a factory producing soldiers faster than German guns could eliminate them, which, in the most essential sense, was exactly what it was. The beaches of Normandy taught the world a lesson about the nature of modern warfare that has never had to be taught again with quite the same force. They demonstrated that in the industrial age, war becomes a competition not of warriors but of productive capacity, not of tactical brilliance but of logistical efficiency, not of individual courage but of collective organizational power. The German soldiers who faced the Allied invasion were not by any measure inferior soldiers. They were in many respects superior soldiers, better trained, more experienced, with better individual weapons and more sophisticated tactical doctrine. They were defeated by something training and experience and tactical sophistication could not address. They were defeated by the decision made years before in American factories and British shipyards and Canadian munitions plants that produce more of everything than any single nation could match. When the German defenders of the Atlantic Wall tried to hold back the Allied invasion, they were trying to hold back something that had been building years across an ocean, something that represented the full productive commitment of the most powerful industrial economy in human history, something that did not reach its limit at the waterline of a Normandy beach and simply stop. They fired until their barrels melted. They fought until their ammunition was gone. They watched wave after wave after wave, and every wave was replaced by another, and behind that wave were more ships on the horizon, and behind the ships were more factories producing more ships, and behind the factories was an America that had turned the manufacture of victory into the most sophisticated industrial process the world had ever seen. In the end, Heinrich Seeau, alone in his bunker, surrounded by everything he had done and the proof that it had not been enough, understood something that no amount of training or ideology had prepared him to understand: that the war, whatever it had been before June 6, 1944, was now something else entirely. It was not a question of courage or sacrifice or the will to fight. Those things were still present. They were simply irrelevant. The mathematics had been decided somewhere else, in places these young men had never seen, by forces they had never understood, and the beaches of Normandy were merely where the answer was delivered. They had brought their courage to a mathematics problem, and the mathematics did not care.